So that's, Scrum and Kanban. So now as we've laid this out, what are we're going to talk about some of the pros for Scrum. Like, what are the reasons the strengths of it? One of the ways, and we're going to see this with a little bit of both of them, is it's flexible. The way sprints work is it allows you to sort of zig and zag your way through a project or a product development. So you can focus, and feels a little more ziggy zaggy, where it's like you're going to do a burst, you're going to do this sprint in a direction, which that direction being whatever your scope is for that sprint. And it may be like, this sprint, we're going to focus on front end stuff. And so you're going to do a lot of front end work for this sprint. And then you may zag back and say, oh, now this next sprint, we need to catch up. We've got to do a lot of middle tier stuff, or we're going to do some back end stuff, or we're going to focus on, I don't know, like user registration feature here. But then this other sprint, we're going to focus on reports. So if you think about it, you're sort of, taking these sprints in a short period of time, in a short direction, and you're really focused more or less, because there's going to be a theme to each sprint. So as those themes are developed, you're working your way towards the complete product by shooting ahead on each of these themes until you get to completion. One of the benefits of it is it allows you to take big projects and split it into smaller pieces. So if it was going to take you a year to get the project done, instead of just having a year's worth of tasks and trying to figure out how we're going to get those done, you have these smaller bite-sized sprints where you can say, oh, okay, well, we've got, a year's worth of stuff, but now we're going to sort of group some of these things and we're going to tackle groups of tasks. Sprints are great for like face-to-face time, and the sprint cycles they're awesome for feedback. You have daily meetings, I didn't mention before, but you have these daily stand-ups where you have a brief meeting every day, which allows feedback amongst the team. But also each sprint cycle, each complete sprint, you have times where you're really presenting and eliciting feedback from your customers. But then you also have stuff as a team where you're giving feedback to each other. How did we do? How can we do this better? How can we make improvement? So there's a lot of feedback that is built into how sprints work. And there's some clarity there too. That makes it, in a sense, a very simple structure, because you have the roles. You're a product owner, you're a scrum master, you're part of the dev team. And it's basically like you're either driving the product as product owner, either coaching the team as a scrum master, or you are getting things done if you're the development team. And so that makes it, pretty easy to know where you fit. And Scrum is sprints and scrums are very popular. There is a lot of information and content out there in the forms of books and websites and podcasts and YouTube channels and all however you consume content. There is a lot of it out there to help you, whether you're just getting started or whether you're wanting to take your Scrum sprint to a whole new level. There's a lot of stuff out there. So it's a really big community, and they tend to be pretty good about welcoming others in and trying to help everybody get better doing it. So after all that, what are some of the cons? What are some of the downsides to scrums and sprints? Well, one, all of that, you go back and we talked about all of that feedback. It also equates to, there's a lot of meetings. There's these stand-ups every day. There's reviews, there's retrospectives. Sometimes, depending on how how they're run and stuff like that, they can just, feel like you're spending your life in meetings. Along those same lines, it is not easy. It is difficult to understand and really embrace how the Scrum approach works. Because it's in some ways a very simple structure, there is a lot that it puts back on the team members to own essentially their role and what they want to do, and to own the fact that they are part of this team and they have a role in making it successful. And that can be difficult. And it can be, especially if you're not if you're not really a self-starter, if you're somebody that likes a lot of structure and a lot of direction, it can make very difficult for you to step into a Scrum environment. Workflow, because of the way sprints are configured and the way you scope stuff in, the way you do that zigging and zagging, then sometimes that can be too rigid. Particularly if you think of like, if you're software support, if you're dealing with bugs and stuff like that, customers report bugs. If you have a 1 month sprint cycle, then the fastest they're going to get an answer back is a month. And sometimes that's not going to work. So sometimes, with sprints, your workflow can be sometimes too rigid for what you really need to do to make your customers happy. It's not often mentioned that I've seen, but a really good point is that there is burnout that can come, because typically what happens with sprints is you just go from one sprint into the next sprint, into the next sprint, into the next sprint. And while companies have figured out that, like, doing a sprint over, the Christmas, New Year holiday stuff, that December holiday period, usually they're not even going to bother with a sprint because so many people are out. You may have that as well if you're, maybe if you're in Europe or somewhere where they have, like typically like in August where everybody's off for a week or two, then you just sort of say, okay, we're going to pause and we're not even going to be working on a sprint during this time because we know most of the people will be unavailable. You may have annual conferences or something like that where most of the people are not available. But other than that, typically what happens is it's just like sprint, 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 sprint. There's no pausing or time in between it. And it can cause burnout because it just feels like you're every day, you just got stuff to do. Now, in some cases, that's perfect. People love it. But typically what happens is if you don't have some breaks in there, maybe you go a couple sprints hard and then you take a couple of days off or something like that. There are just other bits of work that don't get done because they're things that you typically would need to do, but they're not part of a sprint. So it's sort of not on your radar until it becomes an issue. And that can be a problem. So having a little bit of time to say, okay, you're not working on sprint work today. You're just catching up on other job related stuff. You just go that route. And finally, flexibility, really along with that workflow, is that sometimes sprint cycles can take too long, and that zigging and zagging needs to be broken up even, to a smaller level. Oops. So the pros of Kanban. I talked about sprints and Scrum. So let's go back and talk about Kanban boards. So visibility is a huge plus for that, because you can look, if you go back to your Kanban board, you can see that and boom, you know where you're at. You have at a, visually very quickly, you can understand where you're at and what the work is. Now within those, sometimes those notes are very, those Post-its have very little information on them, but the idea is that, typically what you need to know, you can put on one Post-it or one card, and then you're off and running. It's flexible because you can, choose your item you're working on and then, work it through to completion or flip it back to the backlog. And because you're not in a time frame where you're, with that sprint structure, then it's just like you come in, you work on something, you get it done. And if you do it, the best ways to get those things done are where you come in, you work on it. If you're not able, if you're going home for the day or off for a week and you're not able to work on it, you put it back into the backlog and have it in a situation where somebody else can pick it up and run with it as needed. So you don't have those, those time frames. So it makes it much more flexible. It's much more granular to do Kanban, which is the next point. It's easier to allocate work without overloading a member. Everybody's working on something at a given time, ideally, and they're not, they're working on an item that's in progress. They're not working on 10 items. They don't have a whole bunch of stuff sitting in their queue that says, here's all this stuff you're doing. You're doing whatever it is you're doing today. Versus sprints, sometimes there's a tendency, even though it's not recommended, where people will go into a sprint, they'll assign a lot of the stuff, the work out at the beginning of the sprint. And so you may have somebody that gets all their work done early and they're basically sitting there twiddling their fingers while somebody else is just overloaded and is working 80-hour weeks to crank their way through that sprint. Kanban boards are going to require less meetings because it's basically just look at the board. You don't have to spend a lot of time meeting about it. You can, you may talk about tasks and stuff like that, but definitely the meetings disappear, or, you have far fewer because you're not doing that regular, all of those pieces that are part of each sprint. You may still do some of those things. So you may do reviews, you may do retrospectives and things like that, but they are not, they're not done maybe necessarily as often, and definitely not tied to timeframes like sprints are. And there's the ability to focus. If you don't have 10 things on your to-do list, particularly if you don't have multiple things that you're somewhat working on, and instead you're working on an item and take it to completion and then move on to your next task, that allows you to focus. So you're not stuck in something where you're, having to bounce back and forth between a couple of different things or different environments, things like that. It's just like, go work on it, get it done. You're off and running. Much like, as we've talked about in the past, when you think about the Pomodoro approach, is you focus for you're in this case, it's not for, that time period, but it's focus until you get it done. And then when you come back to it, when you're ready to do some more work, pick up your next task and do that. And so that also allows you, instead of that zigging and zagging and sort of being a little bit locked in a direction for a while, it allows you to go to work for a while, get something done. If you have something else to take care of that. And then you can come back and you can work on whatever the next ticket is. So the cons to that, the downsides to Kanban, it lacks structure because you have this very minimal structure. It's going to be lacking. You've got your backlog, you're doing it and you're done. And sometimes that can be, now you can add more steps, but typically it's just, you go grab something to work on, you work on it till you're done, and then you move on to the next one. So you have to be much more intentional to make sure that you include pieces like reviews and retrospectives. There are the specialist approach to software that is sort of a legacy approach in a sense. Is Kanban is not as useful for teams where they've got like diverse silos. So if you've got like a front end person, you've got a middle tier person, you've got a back end person, you've got a testing person, you've got a design person, you've got a user experience person. When you have people that really only have certain, if you think of that backlog, if really there's only, one or a very limited number of people that can do any of those tasks, then it's not as useful because those people are going to have to pick the tasks that they can do. If you've got a team that has a broader set of skills, then you're going to be able to, where each member has a broader set of skills, then you can have any member can take any ticket essentially. And that's the ideal approach to Kanban, is that any one of your development team can pick up one of those things to be done and do it. That is where Kanban really is going to shine. And if you don't have that, the further you get away from that, the further cross-training and cross-skill set you have in your team, the less useful Kanban is going to be. Updating can be a pain. As I said, one of the ideas is that you can go work on something and then pause essentially and put it back into the backlog for whatever reason. And doing so and making sure that documentation or that your situation is frozen properly, that somebody else can pick it up, can be challenging. It really does have to be like a habit of the members of the team to make sure that they properly, like commit stuff. They use good comments. They do updates if there's, changes to the scope or the requirements on a card, that they get those things documented. It doesn't have to be like complex and, full requirements documents each time, but you do have to keep stuff up to date. Otherwise, it becomes really confusing really fast. There is a limited size as well to what a single Kanban board is useful for. If you think about it, and go back to this example, if you go here, there's, I don't know, 15, maybe 20 items in your to-do, and, about the same in your work, and you're done. Done doesn't really matter, but your to-do, if it gets huge, if like I mentioned before, like if you lay out all of your Kanban tasks for the next year, and particularly if you think about like a Kanban card, typically you probably, it varies, but you're going to be able to knock out on average, maybe, 1 to 4 tickets a day. You got a team of 10 people, that's, 10 to 40 tickets a day. And you do that over a year, that pretty quickly runs up to, 1,000 cards sitting there, which is just overwhelming. Now, a lot of times what happens, even if it's digital, even if it's electronic, it can get overwhelming. And a lot of times where sprints will sort of group that stuff during a time period, whatever a sprint is, sometimes you'll have different Kanban boards. You'll have multiple boards that will be, maybe breaking out feature sets within the application, or there's a lot of different ways that those can be done to sort of shrink that down. It's one of those, it can be daunting to see 1,000 items out there, and then to find the right one, to go say, okay, what am I going to do? Maybe you just pick at random, but maybe there's certain things that you're better at, and it takes a while to sort through or to review what's out there to pick what you're going to work on next.